David Margowsky.
Hey.
Yay. Reserved, I like it. Well, hello.
Hello.
If you do have questions in the middle of the presentation, just go ahead and throw your hand up and we'll deal with them right there. There is some time at the end as well to ask some additional questions, so questions are good. Projects are simple affairs. You sign a contract, get your deposit, and get to work. You work your way through the 5 traditional steps of the project: initiating, planning, executing, controlling, and closing. Then you deliver your finished work. Your client thanks you, offers you a bonus. You finish in half the time estimated, and you get to go to Disneyland. Right? Isn't that how it happens? Okay. So the reality is, projects are like ravaging monsters, and if they're left unchecked, they'll kill your profit margin and possibly your livestock. Projects are werewolves, and I'd probably put an expletive or two in there, but we're going to figure out how to deal with them. A little bit of warning: there's no such thing as a silver bullet. Every werewolf is different, and despite your best efforts, there isn't a magical solution for taming them. However, a good process is the closest thing you're going to get to a silver bullet. A good process gives you a plan to follow, and a good project management plan has a few components, and that's what we're going to talk about. Scope. How much are we doing? Understanding the scope of the project that you're undertaking really well. It needs to be written down. It needs to be as familiar, and you need to be as familiar with it as possible. We've talked about scope before here, and it can contain the following: deliverables, timeline, cost, expectations, services to be provided, your process, your measuring stick, and stakeholders. So all of those pieces should be in your scope somewhere, so you understand them and so your client understands them.
Dave, would you mind just going over quickly in your mind what scope is?
Well, I mean, for me, it's what I just listed there.
Okay.
It's those items. It's the game plan. It's your blueprint. It's this is what I'm doing. I'm building it. You're measuring twice, cutting once, hopefully.
Okay.
So yeah, it explains the project in full details. You need to know your scope because you need to know when your scope starts to creep. But you also need to know when it doesn't. A lot of times your client will have one idea and your team will have another. And as a project manager, you have to balance between the two of those to make sure that you're meeting your obligations and that you're not getting pushback from your team when you shouldn't be. Next is communication. If there were one item in the plan that is the most important, it would be communication. You have to have an open and active line of communication, not only with your clients, but with your team. We do a daily stand-up for all of our active projects. What's happening, what needs to happen, what didn't happen, and why. In order to course correct, we have to know that there's a problem. So talking to your team is clutch. We also talk to our clients usually on a weekly basis, sometimes more. It's going to depend on the project. We want them to know what's going on. Some of the worst problems are caused by bad communication. I've also seen situations where the decision was made to not communicate with a client. And that sort of avoidance is probably the worst thing that you can do. Why wouldn't you want to communicate with your client?
You got bad news.
Right? And yet, communicating that bad news is probably the most important thing that you can do for the project. And it's the way you communicate that bad news and the way you take ownership of that bad news, should you need to, that really matters. It's really is going to make your project run smooth, or it's going to give you problems. Why wouldn't you want to communicate with your team?
You have more expectations than they initially thought.
Possibly. Also, I think there's personality conflict can become an issue, and if that's an issue, I think it's an issue that needs to be addressed quickly. Developers, as a vast generalization, don't like to communicate. And sometimes when they communicate, they're communicating in a specific way. And so breaking down those barriers and understanding that you are a safe place, I think is important. So communication, that one's everything. Time. How long does it take to build a website? Anybody? Yeah. The answer, as with most things, is it depends. However, we rarely have that luxury. We have a client that has some expectations and we have a schedule to keep. Part of knowing the scope of the project is understanding that timeline that we've promised. Be flexible when setting your timeline and make judicious use of the Scotty principle. Does anybody know what the Scotty principle is? Anybody?
There's a hot dog stuck in the warp drive?
Pretty close. So Scotty from Star Trek in the original show, in one of the movies he reveals that he always doubles the time that's needed, so then whenever he accomplishes whatever he has to do for the captain in half the time, he seems like a hero. Now, I don't recommend that you double your times. I don't even necessarily recommend that you extend them, but you definitely want to build in a cushion. You want to have some flexibility when you are estimating. And time is one of the main areas where you want to have that flexibility. Just at WordCamp LA a couple weeks ago, Matt Cromwell gave a talk, and he was talking about not giving a date and dealing with milestones and having that set your timeline. At Pixel Jar, what we like to do is we like to set our first date, knowing we're going to have a deliverable around this time, and then letting dates that would cascade off of that kind of happen as they happen naturally, and setting our timelines that way. But for some projects, your client is going to have, I need it by X, and you're going to have to make that promise or not, and you're going to need to deliver it.
Also, one of the problems I've discovered with time is the root of it, the root of the problems in time comes from scope creep, whether it's on the client's side or your side. That's what causes the problems with time.
Definitely can.
And if you don't communicate in writing and document that, you're in trouble at the end.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think we cover it. I think I do cover that a little bit later. Is that when scope creep happens, communicating cost is our first concern almost always, right? Because we're. Hey, how you doing?
Come on
in. We go to cost right away because we're thinking about money and we're thinking about that's going to be the problem. I think cost, timeline, and not just the timeline in terms of to do this is going to take X, but what those impacts are for the rest of the timeline after. Because if it's something that is dependent on other pieces, we'll get to that. Let me get to that. Yeah. Track your burn rate. Depending on the size of the project, this might happen daily or weekly. You have to be able to judge whether the time you're expending is matching your expectations for completion.
Can you say that again? Because that's a super important concept.
Sure. Track your burn rate. You have to be able to decide, I've spent this much time in this much time. Am I on course for the rest of this project? So if you're not using something to manage your time, start, even if you're working for yourself.
Especially if you're working for yourself.
Don't forget testing time and the ramifications of that test, possible bug fixes.
If it failed, ship it.
Right,
Come on.
right, absolutely.
One, I think, note I'll share at our team, literally a third of our process is creative, a third of our process is development and client work, and a third of our process is QA. And
Nice.
QA is so, so important. Like, it doesn't matter that you have a good product, it doesn't matter that it looks okay, it doesn't matter that it builds, it matters that it works. And so it's really hard to define what that is, and that matters, of course, from scope. But at the end of the day, QA can help quite a bit once you've actually got all these things together. You know, even if it's just typos and making sure that images look okay. That can be really, really basic QA. It can also be, more technical QA.
Would you say that QA is the same as UAT?
Which is,
I wouldn't say that because I don't know what UAT is.
UAT, and I'm the client side now. UAT is user acceptance testing.
That is part of
That's a component.
testing.
Okay.
Yeah, it is one of the
So
tests.
do you consider in your format of the 30% of QA, do you consider that user experience, is that part of your 30%, or is that in addition to that regular QA section?
It, of course, depends on the client and depends on the project and depends on the shape of it.
Mm-hmm.
If we know that something, like a component, for example, is really buggy, or we know that something isn't quite done, but we want the client's feedback, we have to really hold their hand and say, don't freak out, the colors here don't match, or
Right.
whatever isn't working right,
Right.
but what do you think about X?
I
So
see.
you use the project management role to really lead the conversation to figure out what the UAT component you're actually testing for is.
Yeah.
When you say 30%, is that a time expenditure
Yes.
and budgetary expenditure?
So what we found is the more we budget on QA, the less we have to budget for development in the future. So especially for long, like ongoing projects, maybe there's like an initial, project, and then there's the ongoing part of the project. But if you have the initial QA, you have a much smaller expenditure. So you can actually expense part of your burn rate over a course of a year if you put it all front.
Nice.
I don't know if that may be a little bit too. But
Nope, I got it.
Yeah.
All right. Any other questions on time or comments? Cool. Cost. How much does a website cost? How many times do you hear that question? It depends. Just like time, and probably because of their relationship to one another, cost is tough. Ideally, you have someone else on the team who has to worry about estimating the project. As the project manager, our concern is making sure that our team isn't costing us more, again, usually in time expenditure, than we have estimated for the project. You could also discover additional expenses for the project as you're iterating. Maybe the free plugin that you thought was going to work isn't. You may need to purchase a premium plugin to solve the same problem. Looks like I don't have enough sitting there. All right. Cost. Dependencies. Most modern development uses an agile process, right? There are a lot of flavors and brands with the attendant certifications. Probably have heard of Scrum. But the basic idea is you build something very quickly and then can iterate on the process as you continue to develop. Even using these methods, there are still services that you provide that can't be started until a previous deliverable is complete. Great examples of this are wireframes to mockups. You're not going to start building your mockups until your wireframes are approved. You'll have to look at those dependencies when you start putting your timeline together for the project. And when things start to shift, you'll need to look at how those shifts are going to impact not just the item in process, but the next item in the series. So this again gets back to what we were talking about when there's scope creep, and that scope creep is on a specific item that you're trying to complete. It's not just impacting the item that you're trying to complete, it's impacting everything down the line. And sometimes that is not a direct correlation, meaning if the item is taking an additional 2 days, that might be an additional 15 days as far as the impacts to your project. Because if you're a team like ours, you're not just working on one project at one time. Maybe you have that luxury and your impacts are a little more attached to the delivery dates, but in most cases it's not going to be the case.
And actually, the smaller your team, like me, I have 3 projects lined up that one of them was supposed to have already been started 2 weeks ago, and I haven't finished the first one yet. So it's pushing 2 other projects out, and I got people waiting, so that's what you gotta watch your time for.
Absolutely. Contingencies. Expect the unexpected. No matter how clear your scope seems at the beginning of the project, how easy, straightforward, or whatever other simplifying term you hear from your client, no matter how flexible the timeline or the budget seems, there will be something unexpected that arises. As a project manager, you need to be as prepared as you can be for those unexpected issues. I really need to get to my notes here. We'll try and rattle them off, but wow.
Maybe a little technology issue.
Yeah.
Mr. Margowsky.
Talk about
Definitely.
contingency.
Yeah.
Contingencies. Wing it. So, I mean, the main question is, right, how do you prepare for something that you cannot be prepared for? So, there's a few things. We talked about the Scotty principle as far as time goes. Make sure that you are not running your projects so close to your budget that you don't have any wiggle room. We are all trying to get the job in the door. We all want to make the client happy. We all want to close the business. If that close is so close to your budget that a mistake causes you to lose money, then you have a problem. If you complete a project or a task in the project ahead of time, let's say mock-ups as a great example. If you budgeted 2 weeks for your mock-ups and they only take you 1, don't relax. Keep your team moving forward on the next phase of the project. Any advances you can make in your timeline are like bonus time. They may be used up later in the process. They may be an early delivery. That would be wonderful. But don't be afraid to keep your team moving, keep your team working. We talked about timelines, keeping those flexible and fluid. And I'm sure there's one more element, but I'm also going to hit communication again. That is one of the best ways to deal with contingencies. When something comes up, don't be afraid to talk about it. Talk about it with your team. Talk about it with your client. There's a great possibility the client already knows about the contingency and they're probably the source of it, but you need to have that conversation. It should not be something that you are avoiding or are afraid of, despite them being dressed in Nazi regalia. All right. Ultimately, you have the same goal as the client. You want to complete the project on time, on budget, and with all of the functionality that you've proposed. A clear process helps to make you feel like you are in control. While this control is an illusion, it should allow you to survive most attacks. Questions?
Where did you get these great graphics?
Right?
I love my
Movies, man. These are all werewolf movies.
So, Dave, can you talk a little bit about
Sure.
kind of the internal discussions that go on when competing priorities happen, right? So you've got multiple projects. you as the project manager, or maybe you have more than one project manager at Pixel, I don't know.
Just one.
But if it's just, if you've got multiple issues happening, multiple projects, how are you as the project manager helping the team manage resources, timelines, communicating that to the customer? How does that work?
I mean, it's not, there's no like magical formula to it. It's usually a question of which deliverable is going to be first. Sometimes it'll be, you know, which project is bigger, which project will be derailed more, and it's kind of assessing what all of those variables look like. Again, we like to work our timelines fairly flexibly. We don't like tight deadline projects as a general rule. Obviously, we'll take them.
Sure.
But most of the time, I have the flexibility with the team that I can reprioritize as needed. And if I'm ever in question, I can always go to them and kind of say, here's what I'm hitting and here's the problem. So again, it becomes mostly communication, but a lot of times I'm just able to make the call based on which deadline has to be hit first.
One of the problems with any kind of a project, be it a software project or any project you do, is a clear understanding of the client's needs. And this is something you don't get paid for. This is something you learn from experience and over time. But it can either solve great problems in the future with all these things you brought up, from scope creep to mitigations, etc. What steps do you as a professional take in evaluating clients' needs, their expectations, whether it's a timeline, whether it's a content expectations, whether it's a artistic expectations or whatever? What do you do? What are some tips you might have for other developers?
I think, I mean, there's a lot of it what comes from asking a lot of questions. Have conversations and ask the right questions. And I think you learn those questions over time, and I think you refine those questions over time. We have a massive, like, kind of a spreadsheet of like all of the different component questions that you can ask. I know there are some firms who will like send a big questionnaire to their clients and kind of be like, here, answer all of that. And I have found over time that that can be overkill for most clients. Most clients can't.
They can't answer the questions.
They can't answer the
They've
questions.
never seriously considered them themselves.
Yeah. So what we try to do is we try to section the discussion into logical components, you know, as far as have technology discussion. And in doing so, you can kind of gauge the level that your client is coming to you. They may not have a clear understanding of the technology. They may have a better understanding of the technology than you do. You know, if their server is a completely custom, complex job, then they may be like, okay, here's what we need to do. And you just have to be able to talk to them. If you're not able to answer those questions, and I think most importantly, if you're not able to admit when you don't know what they're talking about and say, well, I'm not quite sure what you're saying, like there's a big stigma that people have of seeming like they don't know something. You can't possibly know everything. Even about one thing, there's the possibility that you don't know everything. So you have to be able to engage and understand, and then you have to be able to modify.
Is there a differentiation between a client who's never had a website versus one with an existing? Is there a different process you go through?
I think that process-wise, it's not so much that we change the process, but the conversation is definitely different, right? Like they're coming with a very specific pain point in most cases when they have a website that, you know, that isn't doing what they want to do. And they want to get from A to B. And so you need to understand what A is and what B is. And you know, what that path is going to look
The
like.
new client doesn't even know what A is, right?
Exactly, exactly. And a lot of times the difficulty with a new client is that they want everything, right? They want to be at B and they're not even at A. And I think that understanding that like a website is never a finished thing is a difficult idea for a lot of people. That you don't finish a website. You meet your current set of goals and expectations, and then you realize, well, I have a whole nother set of goals and expectations, and then you meet those, and then you have another set of goals and expectations.
And if you create this project, how many of those projects do you do where there's a secondary project that is developed as a result of the first that you kind of do cleanup on? Okay, let's defer that to another project, and we'll take these 2 or 3 items, throw in there, but let's get this one done first and solve problems that way.
You know, definitely I want to say at least 50% of the projects that we work on have a phase 1 and a phase 2. Sometimes people want to be done, you know, whether they actually are or not, they want to be done. They're like, okay, we've spent what our budget is, and we're going to see now if this meets our goals. We're always open to continuing with a client, but you know, sometimes they want to be wrapped.
But if you have a client, how many of them are repeat clients for repeat projects, you know, website refurbishing in 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, whatever, or other things that you can do for them?
Well, I mean, Pixel Jar specifically, I'd say probably about 80% of our clients are reoccurring. We obviously want all of our clients to be reoccurring. We love to have clients who have retainer projects with us so that we're continuing to develop for them for, you know, a long period of time. But it's going to depend on their needs.
I think it's also like the shape and format. So right now I'm working on primarily publishing projects. So I'm working with sites that have lots and lots of contents, that are publishing blogs and special feature articles and special projects. Like the nature of development that I'm doing tends to be very iterative. And so we don't actually have phases at all. We have a retainer basis, we have projects, we have scrums, we have like a rapid cycle that is, you know, built into a business cycle. That's very different than most people who are, you know, small mom and pop business in that vertical. You know, you come in, I want to start a website for my restaurant. You know, you have a very clear goal and a very clear expectation. It all depends on the kinds of conversations you're having. I think it's best when you're building a website from the beginning to talk about best practices, to talk about SEO, to talk about advertising, to talk about all these other things that your website will become a hub for, versus when you're looking at a bigger project that has performance issues or SEO and SERP and all these other things that are happening that you really, really care about. That's a very different kind of conversation. Like, if I had that conversation with the mom and pop who wants to open up a website, or have a website for their restaurant that's opening up next month, those are two very, very different conversations. And if I have the harder conversation with them, I will lose their business because I will overwhelm them.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I think it also goes to this idea of going back to the mom and pop. So let's say you have a customer that comes that has a website for their restaurant versus someone like for me who I work for an enterprise, right? And so there is never, to the point that Dave was making, there is never an end to what our website is, our SaaS platform, right? So we are constantly in a phased approach. We, you know, have 25 internal developers and 35 external developers. We were constantly working on, you know, I think this year we're on phase 62. So, you know, I think it really just depends on what kind of project you're working on. But I think it's also important to recognize from the client this discussion of time, because time is money, right? And so if it's taking, and this is what I find very interesting about project management, especially project management when you're talking about a deliverable, right? So from my side of the fence, I manage a lot of vendors or partners that facilitate things for me as the client. And when a project manager is either unclear about the timeline or I don't understand the timeline, there is always some sort of disagreement that becomes clear very quickly. But more so than anything, it's both a monetary issue on their side and my side, right? I wrote down in my notes, tracking the burn rate is very interesting concept, because often I've had project managers come to me and say, this is now costing me or my company way more than we had anticipated. And the question I'm always interested in, and I kind of say that cheekily to Steve, is that your problem, or are you now making it my problem? And that's the question I'm interested, not only for Dave and the project manager, but there's a couple of other, obviously. Mike is Zeke's project manager, and Britt, who does project management. And those of you else who've had experience, I mean, you don't have to be a project manager to know how to do project management, right? What does that look like when you're having that conversation? When those challenges have become primary, they are costing you money, right?
It looks kind of like that.
How do you have that conversation with me as the client? How do you say to somebody, I recognize that whatever's going on here, this is now, there's a financial component to me, and therefore a financial component to you. Whether you're an agency, like Steve's business, or a freelancer, like you had said that you are the only resource. How do you have those conversations? I'm really interested to hear what everybody has to say about that.
I mean, the answer to your question part of that is, it depends, right?
Yeah.
It can be bad planning. Like, well, how did you anticipate that amount of time? What was that based on?
Yeah.
Obviously, we all want it to be based on our experience. You know what I mean? We want to have been like, well, you know, we've done something like this before, and that's why people look for people who have done exactly their project. But it's sort of unrealistic in a lot of ways, right? Because,
Sure.
you know, nobody has done your project before.
That's right.
Maybe they've done something similar, but probably not. So, if your estimate is bad, then you've got a problem, and you have to.
When you mean you, do you mean
I mean the
you?
client, yeah,
Or the
yeah.
client,
No,
me?
no,
Right.
no. I mean, maybe.
Right.
You know, it depends on how your contract's written. Knowing your contracts, it's probably
It's you.
It's probably my problem.
I'm sure you do.
But you know, most smart businesses are going to have some, you know, should we find X, that may impact the budget or the timeline, depending
Sure.
on how it's worded. In some, you know, some businesses do not equate budget and timeline.
Great point. Yeah.
We tend to tie them closer together, but I'm sure everyone in this room has probably heard of value pricing, which is not a bad concept. Love it. It may work for certain projects. It doesn't tend to work for most of the ones that we're bidding on. So in that case, it may be, you know, bad judgment on estimating, bad estimating basically, makes it our problem. But it depends on the company, and now I'm very fortunate to work for two really good guys, and part of why I work for Pixel Jar is because of their ethics. So when that happens, we say we've underestimated, we have a problem. That doesn't mean that you can't open it up for negotiation and go like, you know, this is going to break us. You know, this will destroy us if we have to, you know. So what can we do? Hasn't happened. You know, we're pretty good with our estimates. The other factor is always scope creep, right? Are these time discrepancies being caused by changes or unclear expectations between you and the client? No, the vendor in your case, right? Unclear expectations that are making your timelines grow. If that's the case, then it might be a you problem. But it was their responsibility to discuss that in hopefully a human and positive way,
Sure.
and make sure that it was expressed to you that, okay, we can absolutely do that, but here are what those impacts are. So it's not a fun, like, that's the worst part of project management.
Well, and I think that's why I said it, because I think it's probably most important. Yeah, there's a lot of people on hands up.
I missed Jamal earlier. Let me.
Well, it's a different subject, so maybe you should go
Okay,
to
Dave.
For me, that's a conversation I try to have with the client in the beginning. Like,
you try and scope it as best you can, like Dave was saying, and you kind of, after a while, you'll know, like, this thing, this piece of it may be quick and it may not, you know, and you tell the client, we're not sure what we're gonna find here. Like if you're going into your house and knocking down a wall,
Sure.
you might find something. It's kind of like that. So you try to prepare them. Hopefully this won't happen, but it could. And if so, how are we going to deal with it?
And how do you, that's a great point, how do you prepare me contractually? So that I'm not just saying, well, I remember you kind of saying that, but
Yeah.
now that we're here and you've knocked down the wall and this thing's ugly.
Put language like that in the scope document.
Uh-huh.
And I never use the word quote.
Right.
I say estimate
Yeah,
for that reason.
that's
because you
great,
may
that's a great
find
point.
something.
Estimate,
Yeah, it's always an estimate. Because it's our best guess. You know, my
Right.
best guess.
before knocking down the wall, you don't know what's behind it.
If everything's perfect back there, then it's like this, and then I have no problem. But then you don't know what you're going to find, or how long it will take to, or how much it will cost
Yeah.
to fix it. And that should be on me, because it's the client's thing coming to me. So I'm trying to help them, but it can't be on me for that. Now, if I don't estimate well, then
Mhm.
it's on me, like you said. So.
What is Scrum and what is value pricing?
Okay, so value pricing I'll start with because that one's a little easier. Value pricing is pricing based on the value of the project, simply that. So it may not equate to time. It may be, I'm building you an e-commerce site that's going to be worth X amount of dollars. Scrum is a flavor of agile project management. You have what are called, they're called scrums, and you have a scrum master, which is the project manager. And it's just you work in sprints, which is usually two weeks.
It's 2 weeks, yeah.
It-
I know this because I have a scrum master at my company, we work in 2 weeks.
It can vary though, if I'm not
You
mistaken.
could do week sprints. NPR does 3-week sprints. So if you read the new NPR website, you'll see they have a 3-week sprint and they release something new every 3 weeks.
And that's just a set amount of time, and it's kind of based on the idea is you can fit this much work into that set amount of time, and then when you're done, you assess again how much work there is. So for some places, that's a fantastic way of doing it. It's a little too foofy for what we're doing, and timeline-wise, our projects tend to be smaller in scope. That's not always true. Yeah. It just, how do you deal with maintenance tasks in a scrum, in a sprint setting?
It depends. So the best Scrum environments have a really good project manager who knows essentially the difference between something coming in, like a new request, like I want to add a feature. Something is broken, this is a red flag, it must get fixed. Or somewhere in between, like this works all right, but it's kind of broken and it's affecting SEO or it's affecting social, something is about it. There may be sort of like 3 levels of priorities. And there's also like nice to have way down the line, maybe priority 5. And so somewhere—
Well, some of the systems, right, manage that, like Jira tickets, you can use those to manage those elements. If I have to put one more freaking Jira ticket in, I mean, it's just like, how many of these things can we have?
But it's really
You can
useful.
have quite a few.
So like if you have a Jira system, so if you're in some environments, you might have Jira as your project tracking system where you're actually tracking issues and bugs and feature requests. And you might be working in a repository like Bitbucket or GitHub. And a lot of that stuff will just automatically sync up. So you as a project manager can put in a ticket, and then I as a developer can respond to that ticket and say, I've done this thing in response to issue number 567, and it's automatically done. And so all of that is synced up. So if I as a developer, or I as a designer, or I as a project manager, or I as a business owner go in, I can actually see the whole train of it. And when it's all working just right, it's actually really cool to see.
It's beautiful.
You can see like all of the Git commits, you can see all of the project pieces. Like it's a big investment up front, but when it's done right, this kind of project tracking system makes development significantly easier, and it saves you typically on what is your biggest project expense, which is usually software development and software engineering. So,
Well, wouldn't you agree also that those kinds of investments from a cross-functional perspective are so critical. So for example, I am one of, let's say, 6 or 7 functional leads at our company. Instead of having to constantly reach out to my project manager, we have 3 or 4 project managers at my company, I can just go in and I can see where my particular tickets are, where they're tracking. So there's a lot of cross-functional work there that is so valuable. And talking about time is money, it can be very, very helpful. I think even in small businesses as well.
I think the other big part of this that I want to share is transparency across a horizontal type environment. So this is different based on where you work and sort of based on the culture of your environment. But the one thing that I found kind of incredible coming onto XWP is that, like, I'm looking at tickets for Variety and Fox News and all this crazy stuff, and I'm like, I just started and I can now see everything the CTO can see. Like, yes, because that's the whole role of it, right? You get the ability to peek into a company and see everything as a developer or as a designer, as a project manager. That kind of transparency gives everyone the same kind of insights. And the other big piece of this I think is also critical is that those kinds of insights are not just beneficial for the project manager, but beneficial for every single person. So when you bring in someone new and you're working in an agency style environment, giving that sort of full look in gives more people, you know, that blind spot issue. So communication isn't necessarily always needed because you already have communicated with the rest of the documents. And
Or you can self-communicate, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
You can say, look at this thing that's happening, look at these issues, and you can build dashboards around it, you can build all these other pieces to it. But again, it's an infrastructure that you have to invest in.
Yeah,
and so
absolutely.
in many cases, that may be like 100 hours of onboarding plus a couple $100 a month in software.
Sure.
But it ends up becoming very valuable because you don't burn down the line.
Did that help?
It's just when we use technical terms, not everybody may know what they are. Just like Jira, it's like, okay, there's another one.
Oh, Jira is a project management tool, and it's a little more, it's more of a technical tool. It has some nice features like states of bug states. So they were talking about whether it's a bug fix, an enhancement, or
Or a maintenance project.
or yeah, and you can assign those out. It also integrates beautifully with Git for repositories. There were a few other. I haven't played with it for a while.
I mean, I like the whole crazy Atlassian nonsense, but there's also Confluence, which is like a wiki system, which is really, really useful.
Confluence. I hate Confluence.
We use Asana.
Ugh.
Like, I swear by my Asana. I
And
love it.
Google
I love
Docs
it.
works just fine, it's free.
Yep.
So like you don't necessarily have to invest in expensive tools. I think the bigger part of it is there's an infrastructure. You have to decide how your teams are going to talk to each other.
And you have to also, I think, manage, that's, I think, a different concept, but I would say this, is that whenever you're talking about tools, like, for example, Confluence, the problem with Confluence is that it's a system where it's not user-friendly for someone like me that is not technical. And so navigating, it goes back to that conversation of UAT, right? What is the user acceptance of something? And that's
actually
challenging.
That's was something I was going to ask. Is we don't often have our clients in our space. We have a few, and if someone requests it, we can certainly accommodate. Asana is very friendly that way. But for the most part, I like to keep clients out of the space unless there's a reason for them to be in it. Now, clearly, with a project of your size,
Sure.
it's a necessity, and like you were talking about, you were able to see where your tickets were and what that, for most of my clients, they would, they have not been able to keep up with their own flow, let's say. So it really depends, it depends on the client and what you're doing with it, but it's an important thing to consider.
Hands up.
Gene, you have, oh, sorry.
Yeah, so on the corporate side, bringing visibility to the stakeholders of the different business units has been incrementally, just has been critical. So we introduced Jira at my previous company, and within 6 months I had every business unit actively creating their own tasks. And I would have a sprint prioritization meeting. So one stakeholder from each business unit that was digitally savvy was on a call, and they got to fight for what was important. And they all were a part of the website and had different business units. And you can't do this on the agency side where you invite all of your clients on the same call. But on the corporate side,
Yeah.
every business unit was to show up each week.
That would be ugly.
And
Yeah.
and so we identify a live break fix is the most critical,
Yeah.
especially if it's affecting money. And then you get to choose, is it a bug or is it an enhancement? Is the bug more important than the enhancement? Does the enhancement, is it attached to revenue generating? Is the bug an issue that affects money? Okay, so then they get all the clients are, all the business units get visibility to, oh, maybe I don't need to speak up this week because that's a big one on their side. So,
So
bringing
is-
that transparency to corporate business units.
So in this
Maybe.
case, project management is internal to the organization, and they don't have to worry about budget or
Correct.
time
Yeah.
other than these things have to get prioritized.
Right.
the
Oh,
way.
you always have to worry about budget internally,
Right.
corporately, I can assure you.
So,
But I
so-
think there's a lot of valuable elements in that outside of kind of the corporate environment, right?
Right.
So when you're thinking about your own, even if you're a freelancer, right, going back to the fact that there's kind of mitigation strategies for whatever amount of time you have to work on a project, right? If it's a money-based issue, right, and it's a challenge that you have to address, how do you prioritize as somebody that has limited resources? How do you prioritize those kinds of things if you're doing even your own project management?
Loosely.
It's always money generating things first,
Right.
and then lead generating things second,
Mm.
and then because we sell a product is third, and then any kind of administrative task is fourth, and then sleep is fifth.
For those of you that have small businesses, or it's maybe you and one other person, is that also, would that be similarly, Priscilla, someone like yourself who does a lot of kind of your own project management? Would you say that that's kind of how you manage your projects in that way?
I can't even answer that.
How do you manage your projects then?
Well, I didn't hear the first part of the question as part of what it was. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
Ask me again.
What I was saying is for somebody who's a freelancer or somebody who has limited resources to work on a project, how do you do your project management? How do you decide what are the important things to do today versus?
Well, I always have a list of things I need to do. If an emergency comes, then that rises up. But it's really, you know, a matter of what's urgent. But I do have things paced out. At a certain point, I've really got to decide if their emergency is really an emergency.
Right. If their emergency is your emergency.
Exactly. And I'm getting better and better at that and going, that's really not my problem.
Well, and that's an interesting point for project management in general. When is your client's emergency your emergency? And how do you manage that?
I mean, my answer is always.
Oh, that's interesting.
If my client is feeling that they have an emergency, then I mean, and again, it's kind of a tough role. With Pixeljar, I'm AM PM, which is not ideal.
What does AMPM mean?
Well, it's a chain of account management and project management. So
You work 24/7.
the account manager always wants to make sure that the client is happy and right, and the project manager wants to complete the projects. So they don't always do this. This is our universal sign for our work together. Yeah. That's it.
Yeah.
It's also the sign language sign for football.
Is it?
Yeah.
All right.
Interesting.
I'm gonna have to stop using that.
Are they tackling each other?
Like a scrum, like you're literally like, you know, you're.
Yeah, another use
Well,
of
see,
the word
a
scrum,
scrum
okay.
is where you lock arms and you move down the field together.
Yeah, that's it.
You know?
Interesting.
So I'm like, going, what's a scrum? What are you guys talking about?
Football.
So if my client feels that they're having an emergency, then it's up to me to have a conversation with them. Usually I'll go phone or something where they can hear my voice, where they can see my eyes is always good. And so that they can tell me what the emergency is, and then we can either talk it down or address it and deal with it internally. But it's that reassurance factor. I mean, whether it's something where we can go fixed,
Yeah.
or whether it's something where I have to, schedule some time to get that fixed later. It's that reassurance. So to me, it's always an emergency if it's there.
There are a few times in our life where Steve will say to me, I'm having an emergency. And when I ask him, at first I was like, okay, but then it happened enough where I'm like, was this really an emergency? Well, when a major site is down, then yes, that's actually an emergency. So it seems to me that technologists who have a very good understanding kind of what the elements are, he seems to have a very good understanding of what emergency is. But I hear, when he's at home, working at home, I hear a lot of the hysteria in the client's voice. And he doesn't, I can tell by his face that it is not an emergency. And I feel the same way as the client, right? A lot of times I'm on the phone with my vendors and I'm ramping up. I'm, oh my God, this is feeling really extreme. Like I really need immediate assistance. But I think the best project managers, and I'd be interested in Dave and other people's feelings, I think the best project managers, if it's not truly an emergency, are kind of bringing down the chaos, if you will.
Yeah,
I don't know if
you have
that's
to calm
true,
them
but
down.
that's what, yeah.
It takes a lot of time. I mean, it doesn't take a lot of time, but it does take more time out of my day than I'd like to determine what is an emergency and what isn't. But yeah, most of the time, it's something they don't understand. And I even had one today that keeps asking me the same stinking questions all the time, saying this is not going right. And I test it. It's working.
It's I mean, yeah, I would say in most cases it's not really an emergency, but
You can't make them.
I was gonna say it's the reaction to it, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
if you're feeling that feeling and someone dismisses you, right? You got a problem.
I
You're
don't
just
do
making
all
your
of
own
these.
problems. Hang on, let me. Jean, you had a question. Are you?
Oh, it was, well, yeah, it's a comment and then a question. What we're talking about here is money.
Yes.
There, whether it's on the client side or the developer side. And a good measure of money is one of them you mentioned. But the other one is ROI, return on investment. Whether it's a developer saying, look, I suspect that this project that you've defined and we've communicated on is going to cost X number of dollars, and that's based upon your return on investment of your time that it's going to take to get that job done. How often do you ask of the client, what is your ROI on your website? Where are you making your money? Because based on that, you as a developer can focus, put priorities on things, move things around, shift things around. But if you don't know what my ROI is, or I can't explain to you what that website's doing for me,
Great point.
then we are not communicating.
Well, and it goes back to kind of what your first comments were, is asking the goals are clutch. But even sometimes asking somebody's goals and basing that in reality, two completely different things. Most people don't have any concept of what their ROI is. A lot of what we're getting asked to do more and more is to create tools to demonstrate that ROI. You had mentioned talking about SERPs and SEO. We are getting asked about how do I make money with this thing more and more frequently. Analytics are a huge component of
It's
our
like
business.
60% of what I'm doing is all analytics driven.
It's so important to understand what you're doing and to have realistic goals, right? At some point, you have to pull a number out of the ether if you don't have data to back it up.
But a goal is not a goal if it's not measurable.
You need a
It goes right back to your point.
And that's why
And you've got to convince the client that that goal that he has or she has is measurable, and that goes back to the analytics side.
Yeah.
That's why that's a core component of any relationship with a client.
Yes.
You've got to prove up what you did was worthwhile.
Well, In some cases, yes. In some cases, no. I mean, we are not proving your business concept
Or my model. No.
or your model.
Yeah.
But we definitely have to convince you that what we've built is worth what we're charging.
And that starts with a
And that
baseline.
starts with a baseline.
Do you do analytics on the baseline existing website now, have access to it from your client, so you've got a starting point?
Right.
Because if you don't have that starting point, how do you measure progress? How do you measure achievement? Sure, SEO hits, I mean, there's different things you can do. Response times, I don't know,
Yeah, there's a lot of different metrics. We will often ask our clients, a key component of scoping is, how will you measure success? If they can't tell you how they're going to measure success, then you're not going to be able to measure it, and they're never going to be satisfied necessarily with what you've done. Might not be the case. They may be like, oh wow, this went way better than I thought.
No longer a client.
Yeah.
Don't talk anymore. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's not worth it.
So asking them, what do you see success as? I mean, there's a lot of different ways to ask it, and it's a tough question. People don't have a ready answer for that. So you want to be able to walk them through what that looks like. Here are some thoughts that we have when they say, I don't know. If I get five people, I mean, there could be a lot of different answers. We hear the gamut. Jamal?
Well, as a project manager or account manager, when you come into the picture, at what time? Do you come at the early negotiations, or how much you are involved?
Well, because I'm the AM side of things, I'm usually the first contact.
But assume that you were not. I mean, if you are the project manager.
If you're a project manager, I still feel as early as possible in the process, so much better. If you can come in when they are putting together the scope, that is a huge deal, because hopefully, you've got some experience, so you can look at what they're doing as far as scoping the project and make sure, well, you didn't account for testing. Where's the testing time? Things like that. But also, you start to become familiar with that scope, because you really want to know it backwards and forwards as much as possible. Now, you guys may not know, but I don't write a lick of code. I understand HTML, I understand CSS, and I have some basic understandings. I'm what I call a configurer.
What is that?
It means I can, I can put a WordPress site together and I can configure plugins, but I'm not going to write any PHP to make that happen. So that puts me in my opinion, because I'm self-deprecating, at a little bit of a disadvantage over someone who's going to write code. I like to pretend that it means that my mind is free to let my mouth engage. But
That's good.
that's how I pretend. So as early as possible.
And when do you see the customer? I mean, when you have the contact with the customer?
When do I have contact? Me personally, or
About the project
management?
managers.
I mean, ideally at a kickoff meeting, when you're being introduced, you make that connection. Maybe a little earlier than that. It really is going to depend on how big your team is, how many stakeholders are involved, that kind of stuff.
And since you are AM and PM, does that create a problem?
Yes. I mean, we are small enough in the number of projects that we take on at one time that it has not created a conflict yet.
So I want to talk about this AM/PM
Sure.
conflict, because actually, in my experience, AM/PM has been a conflict at every place I've ever worked, which is always interesting. So typically, a project manager defends the work of their team. They say, I got this project done on this deadline, on the budget, whatever it might be. Like, you've got this thing shipped. And the client comes in and says, it's not right, I have a crisis, I have an issue, and then the account manager is usually talking to the project manager, hey, let's resolve this. So I would love to hear from you and anyone else in the room, like, how are you having we've done something right, it's a long-term investment, or it's especially with SEO and search, like, you're looking at, values over months and if not years sometimes. Like, you're doing something that's going to take a very long time to show its effect. And so instead of turning on a dime for ROI, being usually the first conversation that tends to come about, how are you having that conversation? How do you say, we've done something right here, it's going to work, cool it?
Yeah. So, first answer for you is, as a project manager, my belief is not so much that you are defending the work of your team, but you are defending the project. The project is the goal. So whether that's my team is wrong and they've made a mistake and I need to communicate that to my client, and mea culpa, whatever restitution you're going to make for that, like this is the important piece, is the project. So that's how I ride the middle. And as the account manager, it is, yeah, definitely take in that bad and have the conversation in my head about, okay, well, what's wrong here? But if the project is the most important piece, you're not really at a conflict. What traditionally it is like, this guy, the project manager, wants this gone. I want this thing done and over, and I want to, next items on my Kanban, and then this guy wants more. I want a continuous flow of things. Keep giving me stuff. We could do this for you. We could do this for you. And this guy's going, what are you doing, man? So that's the the mental interplay. But focusing on the project is key. Now, your other question, getting a little deeper into it, is how do you have that conversation? Because you're saying you need to communicate that this is working, but this isn't. You've just got to take the time to let this happen. And I think a lot of that comes with setting those expectations up front, which comes from asking the right questions up front. If you don't know what their goals are, then you can't possibly meet them. So you have to have those questions in place, and then you have to demonstrate, similar to what we were talking about, watch your burn rate, watch that growth rate. And there may be a point where, the tactic needs to change. Obviously, the problem with something like SEO is it's not this turn on a dime, and, as you well know. So you have to make sure that you're not wrecking a plan that's working, but you have to have some kind of indicator whether it's working or not.
I think the delivery is key as well, like how to communicate to, tools, Jira, and Trello, Asana, whatever. The PM and the account manager need to understand the process, and the team, the company needs to work together properly to have a process where the PM respects the developers and the clients, and just so you can have as many tools as you want, as long as you have the process down and everybody gets it and it's fluid. That's important. The delivery communication to the account manager, the way I manage expectations is, yes, we can, but let's get this part done first. And then you talk about phases, and that engages them to know that there's more. It's not like you're dangling a carrot, you're saying this needs to be done first, a foundation, and then you can build on top of that. And then they get excited because they know that you're going to build something pretty kick-ass. So it's fun.
Well, I think the communication, I was just going to say, I think the important part of project management, which I think sometimes can be challenging, is there has to be account management within project management.
Mm-hmm.
And why I say that is because as the client, I need to feel like I'm being managed through my project, right? So that there's a level of respect. My project manager understands what my goals are. I think several people have said that. They understand what the challenges I have internally and externally within my own business, why I'm doing these things, so that I think that inherently there has to be that account management style of communication within a project manager. And so often when we don't have that, it can become contentious, right? Because you're having a dialogue with the client, and project management can sometimes be viewed as, I gotta keep this thing going, heck or heck, right? I gotta do it, and you're coming along and you're doing this, and if it's not working, then I'm communicating to the client. The client may not feel heard. They may not feel like this person's understanding what my goals are. And when that happens, that's when you have very unhappy customers. And so often when I've had conversations with Steve about challenges that are happening at Zeek, that that can sometimes be the issue. And so I think it's an important part of what good project management is that there's account management within it, that idea. I don't know what other people's thoughts are.
I mean, yeah, I mean, I think every person who is going to have contact with client has to understand how to talk to clients, right? I mean, that's why we keep the developers away. It's terrible. I love my developers, and they're both very loquacious. I think, I don't know necessarily whether it's, no, I mean, it is, definitely. Yes, I agree. Because the goal with, account management is always, it's, the customer is always right, and it's about, maintaining an ongoing relationship, unless it's someone who you absolutely do not want to work with again.
Right.
Then you better have that kind of mindset,
Sure.
or,
But I mean, at the same time, it was interesting, the comment I think somebody made here was, there's the idea, David, it was you when you were talking about project managers wanting to move to the next, and account managers. The reality of it is most businesses survive on change order, phase 2, phase 5, phase 10,
Phase 62.
I know now, kind of being a participant in Zeke, just as certainly the wife, if nothing more, I want every change there is. So, it's like, bring it on, bring it on. So, Steve's taught me that in a lot of ways, and I think that that's kind of an interesting dialogue, right? You want that pipeline to be filled. And so that's the other element here, is how do project management help continue that pipeline? Is there a sales function in project management?
There was a really good piece of advice I saw at WordCamp LA. Scott Buscemi gave a talk on how to design a CRM you might actually use. And
Yeah,
I think this is
heard
also
that.
part about what you were talking about earlier. At the end of the day, what you want to do is make sure that you're having a positive conversation with a client, especially if you're a solopreneur, like if you're the only person doing this thing.
Right.
You have to be positive. You have to find a way to encourage people to work with you. You have to find a way to keep bringing that stuff in. And the biggest piece of advice that he gave was that you need to literally spend at least an hour a day, if this is all you do, building your pipeline. So as basic as it sounds, in your case, it's going to be probably more than an hour a day doing account management. But like, that should be part of what you're doing if this is your core business. And you can't just put it as priority 2 sometimes. Sometimes pipeline is priority 1, especially for our products.
yes.
I just have to say too that what you're saying is a lot different than how I manage the project. I'm kind of even thinking about how I'm managing the projects, and number one, the honesty of the vendors I work with, and the account management and project management I think go hand in hand for me. If I have an emergency, I want to feel like it's an emergency, and I'll go and give my work to vendors who honor that this is an emergency to me. I'm also realizing even today, like, I'm working with a project manager who is losing this business, who is losing his company's business because of how he's interacting with me. Like, I will not be awarding them any additional work because this guy is such an expletive. It's totally mouse.
Such an expletive.
He is, and I'm just like, I don't feel like I'm that hard to work with, but come at me with another email, bro, and I'm gonna take the work like today.
Yeah.
Because I can't deal, and it's like, to the point where it's like, I will go around him as much as I can not to have to deal with, like,
Yeah.
But his boss doesn't, apparently he has just no clue about this guy's presentation, rapport, and I'm just,
Well, I
So,
think that goes to show
When
what
project
there's
management goes wrong.
and
I really want to take one of your pictures and like send it to him. Like, this is how I'm experiencing you right now. It's like the one that's
Nazi werewolf.
the one with like the fangs that were coming out. I think it was like what was the word? I think it was the contingencies.
Oh.
That was the one. So I just think I think these points are really valid, even though I'm in a totally different business. Is exactly right. You, as the project manager, are the representation of your company.
But what's really funny is, like, the traditional thought of project management is, oh, you're the guy who's keeping everybody in line, right? I mean, when you
Usually,
start
yeah.
talking about the relationship to the team, it's like, you gotta get your and that's just not a reality. Like that.
Is that reality for any job nowadays? When you have an external customer, It's very hard, maybe if you're a certain kind of lawyer. I mean, there's very few kinds of real jobs in the world today where there isn't a customer service component. You're selling all the time. You're selling the experience.
To
right?
internal and external, to
Exactly.
your coworkers and to the people that you're managing. I mean,
And that was more to my point
Yeah.
is like you have to have a great rapport with your team. If you can't talk to your team, if your team doesn't know that they can come to you and say,
I'm in water.
I got a problem,
Yeah.
this is gonna be late, I'm stuck.
right.
And it's so hard, and I don't mean to belittle developers, I love them, and they do amazing things that I can't do. But there's so much of the ego gets tied up in what they're doing, and sometimes there's logic puzzles where they're going like, okay, I just need to focus on this, and they'll lose time because they're focused on the thing, and they'll solve it, but will they solve it in the time frame that you need? But they need to be able to come to you, and they need to understand, process, and like you were talking about process, they need to understand that if they're in the well, they need to call for help. Yeah, they need to get lasting help.
And is that part of your process internally, that you have worked with the developers and maybe Mike can speak, where you say, listen, if this thing is starting to turn and you're starting to eat up time and you can't make this happen, I need you to wave the red flag. And how
Daily
easy
stand-ups,
is
I
that?
think.
It's daily stand-ups. Daily stand-ups are clutch. It's just, talk to them. Even if it ends up being like 3 minutes of, it took longer to join the call than it did to have the talk, that's fine.
Yeah.
That's all good. Just, how's it going? Any questions, any problems? Just the touch, like, I'm here for you. And even if you make it a funny thing, right? They feel comfortable. It's just, they need to know. When I have something that's particularly onerous, where I'm like, if I'm not sure about the task because I heard unsureness in when we were breaking the task down or when we were scoping the task, then I will put in a note in the task saying, like, we really need to watch time on this one. If there's any issues, let me know. Don't hesitate, or reach out to X as an additional resource.
Sure.
Because Brendan and Jeff do the development. They're also my bosses.
Right.
So it creates this weird kind of like Ouroboros.
Yeah.
But at the same time, they are like the first ones to be like, yeah, that was good. Okay. And we have Nate working with us as well. So if Nate runs into a problem, we'll kick it to
Kick it
which one of them needs to be kicked to.
Yeah.
And that's the thing, is knowing your team and knowing how they work. Everybody has a different personality, everybody works differently. Developers do have a general personality, more.
It's not even the personality so much as like they have to constantly solve these types of problems, right? And so when they can't, it's like a challenge.
Yeah.
And they will eventually solve it.
So the stand-ups are the focus, but then you know who you need to check in on, just to loop back and kind of just.
And it may not even be who, it may be what.
Right.
Yeah.
Like certain types of work that are non-standard. Like we all do some standard stuff, especially in the WordPress world. Everybody knows what a custom post, how to make a custom post.
Yeah.
There's some really easy pieces.
Right.
It's the stuff that's on the fringe that becomes the problem.
So whether I've been a project manager, web producer, operations, I consider myself, and I don't want to be good cop, bad cop, but I'm just the goalie. I keep the ball in play.
Ah.
Keep the ball
I'm
in
just
play.
the guy who yells, "Go."
That's interesting.
So it's important just to keep the project moving.
No matter what team members
Slow
are
it down,
playing.
check in QA, check in. So UAT, I haven't heard UAT in 3 years because I haven't been in corporate in 3 years.
Right,
It's
right.
like a term.
In my world, it's
Yeah.
all about UAT. Yeah.
But one of the reasons why I left my previous company is because our 2-week sprints did not have testing. It was just developer approved and then pushed live. And that made my operations team a lot of hurry up and fix. So
Yeah,
when
that's
I was looking for new positions, do you guys do testing? Do you guys QA? Okay, yeah, I'll submit my
can't
application.
imagine
Thanks.
Steve not
Yeah.
Imagine
So-
no testing. Like,
yeah.
that kind of makes me nauseous.
So, yeah, so, but it's just making sure that whatever the high priority projects are that week or for that timeline, keep it in play, keep moving.
Yeah.
Speaking of testing, is that something you guys do yourselves, or do you give it to someone to test? Is that a service?
I mean, it depends on the kind of testing we're talking about. In that case, that's user acceptance testing, so we can't really do that. So that goes back to the user. What we do for all of our projects is we have a 30-day testing window that once we deliver, the user has 30 days to look things over. That's our standard. Obviously, dependent on the size of the project, that might be a larger chunk of time, depending, a really
So if
big.
anything goes wrong in that,
Anything goes
you
wrong,
guys-
they let us know.
Mhm.
Obviously, we still go through the same kind of rigmarole as far as, is this a bug? Is this an enhancement? You really want to watch for scope creep at that time.
Yeah.
I thought this was going to, make toast. We never discussed toast.
And then,
Um,
getting back to the emergency thing, do you guys do maintenance at that point, or once you hand something off, are you out of the picture?
I mean, we have retainer agreements that are specifically designed for maintenance for clients. We still do the maps under a retainer. So any kind of enhancements that they want to make, definitely if they have an emergency. But we also like to stay out of, we don't get in between our hosts and our clients in most cases. We are not a hosting company. We certainly don't have 24/7 availability like our hosting companies that we recommend do. So we create strong attachments there so that they know that if there's something that is costing them money, that they've got someone to go to. They can also contact us. There's no, we're happy to get involved, especially if they're not seeing the responsiveness that they should be seeing based on, what they're paying for. And if that's the case, that would be there'd be some moves that would happen. If there's an emergency that is something that we need to fix, then our retainer clients get priority scheduling. So that's where, again, the juggle happens, right? If there's an emergency, I have to go, is this really an emergency? If so, then I need to bump somebody's and move it. And usually it has not, the number of stressful days in the last 2 years, I can count on one hand, so. Because of that. We won't talk about the president. Any other questions? Boom.
Thank you.
Yeah.